Hello and welcome to lecture number 2. This one is when to use a consultant. In very broad strokes, the times to use a consultant tend to be on the polar ends of the continuum. Either things are going very drastically bad and so it's imperative that a change be made, so you bring in a consultant in the hopes of getting a quick jolt or a shot in the arm so that things can improve. The other time consultants tend to be brought into companies is when things are going really well, there's profit being made, there's revenue being acquired, and so management within companies say this would be a good time for us to spend money to prevent us from sliding backwards. The times when consultants struggle is when the economy is somewhat flat, companies are doing okay, but there's not the wide variance of the very high or the very low performers. So that's on a macro level. But within each of your companies, when is the appropriate time to call in a consultant? And as you think about that, it really gets back to what we had discussed in lecture number 1, and that is, what is it we are trying to accomplish? If I can get a better handle on what the goal or objective is, I can tell you if it's the appropriate time to bring in a consultant. So let's assume we have an issue where it is appropriate for us to use a consultant. How do we use that consultant? What would the role for that consultant be? And here are some ideas for you. You can bring in the consultant to provide a product. And by that I mean there needs to be a software application created. It may need to be tailored or customized. It may be that you need someone who's familiar with the universe of software applications to do a particular task. And so you bring in that consultant to best spotlight which application would be the best one for you. So it could be you bring them in to help you with product that either they create or that they can identify for you. The other broad reason why you bring in a consultant is to provide a service. Somewhat like a mentor or a coach, they can guide and direct what should be done without actually doing it themselves. They identify the issues. Perhaps they provide a report on morale within the organization. Or they offer suggestions on how marketing a new item could be improved. Or they provide context for training salespeople on how to negotiate or overcome objections. Any of those product or service areas in broad strokes could be a reason to bring in a consultant. But let's get a little bit more detailed now. The times when you bring in a consultant on a particular project may be because the expertise required does not reside within the company. It may be a unique issue that's being confronted. There's been a change in the law and you need to now comply as a company, and you're not really certain how to migrate or transition from your current processes to this new legally required way. So perhaps you'd bring in a consultant with expertise in that particular arena. Or perhaps you're doing something from an IT or a marketing perspective that you've never done before, and you'd bring in someone who has done it at previous companies to help hold your hand through the process. So it could be an issue of expertise that is required from the outside that you do not expect to require long term, only on a project basis. So you bring in the consultant for the short-term duration or project. That would be one reason to bring in the consultant. Another might be as a developmental opportunity for your own employees or staff. There could be some corporate issue that requires attention. Perhaps the staff doesn't have significant experience or maybe even has no experience in this particular issue, but you do expect that it will reoccur. Unlike the first example I gave you where it's a one-time only instance, this is perhaps something that's going to now be a new way of doing business. So you bring in the consultant and you ask that consultant to not only help accomplish the task, but also to develop the staff so that in future iterations they can assume responsibility and provide the task's completion without the help of an outside agency. A third reason to bring in a consultant could be that there are an overwhelming number of tasks to be completed, and even though the current staff has the capacity to do something, it may not be the best use of their time. So while the staff maybe can do the training on the new computer system for the marketing and sales teams, it is not the best use of their time, so you bring in a consultant essentially as another pair of hands. The way that decision is made sometimes is based on, will the consultant require a large ramp-up time to take on certain assignments to free up internal staff to take on the other priorities, or is this a task that is somewhat able to be handled with a very autonomous responsibility of the consultant? They don't need necessarily to take a lot more of the time, energy, and effort away from the corporate employees. So it could be, of the first three, it could be that you need the expertise for a one-time instance. Second example was you expect a change in business and you need the consultant to mentor or guide the existing staff so that they can assume responsibility. The third one mentioned was that you could perhaps bring on the consultant not because the expertise doesn't exist internally, but because you need your internal employees to perform other tasks, and the consultant is merely taking on another assignment as if they're another pair of hands within the company. Another way that consultants can be used is through a vendor management mindset. And by that I mean it's easier for one internal employee to manage multiple vendors that are each expert at any number of projects, as opposed to that one employee taking on the responsibility to design, to evaluate any one particular problem. It's easier for each of us to manage 2, 3, or 5 people, each who are expert in their particular project, than to assume responsibility for that project ourselves. Of course, there's a budgetary concern to that, as it's going to cost incremental funds to bring on consultants to do this labor. However, you do have the ability to have experts doing the work, and one internal employee can be spread that much more completely and comprehensively across any number of projects while being proficient, not necessarily needing to be expert at it. Another way that you can bring on consultants is with the mindset of creating progressive performance over the postponed perfection. Perhaps the consultant can't do the job even as well as an internal employee, but they can get the company 80% of the way there. In that instance, we at least have as a company something to work with that all it requires is some small smoothing out around the edges, incremental improvements, but the lion's share of the work has been done by the consultant. In this way, I can also leverage my internal resources by not having them do some of the more mechanized rote tasks, but only use their expertise to incrementally add or perhaps tailor the project so that it fits the organization more completely than having to rely on the internal employee doing it from the ground up. Sometimes it's appropriate to bring in a consultant because it's a strongly political issue, so that rather than having management take a stand and then have to have some of the blowback from employees, you can bring in the consultant to provide the answer. Now, it's not appropriate to steer the consultant to what answer you want, but if the consultant can objectively come up with a conclusion that's consistent with what the management had expected, then it could be a situation where you get the reinforcement of the outside expert mirroring what management's view is, and therefore the action taken will not be seen quite as politically charged because it's been validated by the outside agency. Hopefully that helps you understand some of the times to use a consultant. Look forward to seeing you in video number 3.